Hi there. I want to ask you today, have you noticed that sometimes our prayers aren't answered? Our problems don't go away, and the Lord doesn't make it all better. We even check and make sure there's no sin in our life that we're aware of that hasn't been dealt with. We check that there are no unforgiveness issues. We check that there's no rebellion in our life, and if we're husbands, that we're treating our wives right. But still, it seems that God's closed his ears to our crisis. What happens then is we start asking that question that God's people have been struggling with since Adam's time. How long, O Lord? How long? This is a question asked in 10 places in the Psalms. Isaiah asked it, and so did Jeremiah and Habakkuk and Zechariah. I'm sure the Israelites asked it many times during the 400 years they were in slavery in Egypt. And again, they asked it, I'm sure, while they wandered around the desert watching a whole generation die off. Many followers of Jesus today still ask that question as they face trials and tribulations and hard times. How long, O Lord? There's actually only one correct answer to that question that covers every situation and all times in history. The delay is there because God is at work, and the delay itself is part of God's plan. Imagine if all our prayers were answered immediately and we never had to wait. It would be like having a genie in a bottle who gave us not just 3 wishes, but as many wishes as we wanted. Our prayers would actually then become commands rather than requests. And this would mean that God would become our servant in heaven, not our Father in heaven and our Creator and Lord. How many times that we shake our heads at parents that become their children's servants and give their kids whatever they demand. But how often don't we expect God to do exactly that with us? Think about it. If we had our prayers answered instantly, and we never had tough times, we'd become weak and lazy. We'd be like those people who sit on the couch drinking cool drink and eating chocolate all day, watching the Comrades Marathon, and then expect to finish his medal later in the afternoon. Ain't gonna happen. If God prevented us from ever struggling, we would have no motivation to change, and we would end up, sadly, spiritually retarded and stagnant. God's goal for us isn't comfort and ease. It's to become like Jesus in our character, our motivation, and our actions. Romans 8 verse 29 tells us this. It says, "For God knew his people in advance, and he chose them to become like his Son, so that the Son would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters." We often hear people talking about, my faith is being tested. And that comes out of James chapter 1 verse 3, where it says, "For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow." Now, these tests of our faith are not for God's benefit. He doesn't need to put us through difficult times to see for himself how we manage. He knows already how we'll manage. The testing is completely and entirely for our sake. God doesn't need to know. He knows already. It's because we forget. We forget that life is really a spiritual activity with a physical part to it. It isn't a physical existence with a spiritual part just tacked on for a bit of mystery and intrigue. Do you know what the life cycle is of a moth? The female lays the eggs. Excuse me. The little worms hatch out and they start eating until they become big worms. And when they're big enough, they spin themselves a cocoon and they pupate. They change from a worm into a moth. And when they're ready, they actually have to chew a hole in the one end of the pupa, that's silk cocoon. They have to chew a hole in it to get out. And a man saw this one day, and he thought he'd help this poor insect that was struggling to squeeze out of this hole in the pupa. And so he carefully cut open that silk sac and set the moth free. The trouble was, the moth ended up with crumpled and shriveled wings and was doomed to spend its brief life crawling around in frustration. The man then realized that while the moth struggled to push itself through that hole in the pupa, or in the cocoon, fluid was forced into the wings, and it caused them to unfurl and strengthen so that the moth would be able to fly. Without that struggle, the moth never reached its created potential. And the same applies to us. The right response for us when we face problems and unanswered prayer, it's found later on in that James chapter 1, from verse 2 to 4. Let's read all of those verses. Dear brothers and sisters, says James, when trouble comes your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow, for when your endurance is fully developed, you'll be perfect or mature and complete, lacking or needing nothing. The truth that we see here is the main reason we go through tough times is not so that our circumstances or the people around us can be changed by God from the outside. The main purpose of our trials is so that we might change. And that change comes, it flows from our endurance, our persevering, ons vasbyt. This word for perseverance or endurance describes somebody who's carrying a heavy load for a long time, and rather than look for a way to dump it, they just keep going. This is a particular type of perseverance where we choose to keep carrying the burden and finish the course rather than slipping out from under the load and giving up. Like the moth, we realize that if we go through the challenge, we come out stronger, and our faith is actually more authentic, dis meer eg. This is a tough ask, but James tells us about two activities that if we keep doing them, they'll help us to hang in there, to endure, to persevere. Firstly, he says we must persevere with joy. And this is a joy rooted in knowing that God's good and perfect will be carried out. It's sure to be carried out. With our sinful nature, we tend to see trials and problems as God's plan for us failing. But the truth is, the trial is God's plan for us, and it's necessary for us in our present season of life. The joy that we need to persevere with isn't necessarily a smiley face or pretending there's no pain in our suffering. If I look back over the last 18 months since I lost my wife, I haven't had a smile on my face every day, and there's been lots of painful times. But God has been so gracious and helped me to choose to remember that my joy is not a mask. It's a deep inner peace that God gives us, and it flows from a confidence through our faith in God. And the second thing we must do, firstly, persevere in our joy, and secondly, we must persevere in our prayer. We must continue to ask in faith and not give up. Because we can either show our dependence on God by continuing to pray, or we can demonstrate our heart of independence from God as we sin against Him by stop praying. Did you realize when you stop praying, it's a sin? Samuel said in 1 Samuel 12 verse 23, "As for me, I will certainly not sin against the Lord by ending my prayers for you. I will continue to teach you what is good and right." It might be tough to keep on praying. And you might even have to pray like that father of the boy possessed by an unclean spirit that Jesus was working with. In Mark 9:24, the father said, "I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief." As we continue reaching out to God in prayer, we are actually proclaiming to everybody that even in these mysterious, these confusing circumstances, God is sovereign, He's faithful, and He is good. And this was actually what James is talking about in verse 6 of that first chapter, where he said, when you ask Him, God, be sure your faith is in God alone. Do not waver, for a person of divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that it's blown and tossed by the wind. So in conclusion, when you are asking that question, how long, O Lord? Remember the moth. Push through. You will benefit and be blessed by your tough times. You'll come out stronger, more capable, and beautiful in God's sight, and so much more Christ-like. If you don't try and duck and dive and just have an easy life, but you persevere, carry your load, keep going, and you will see at the end of the day, you will get your medal. May the Lord strengthen you with this message to do His will. God bless. Cheers.